It is 1957. The linoleum floor is pale yellow, the colour of old cream, worn smooth near the sink where a woman has stood 10,000 times before. The refrigerator hums, a low, steady pulse like a heartbeat the house itself has learned to keep. Outside the window, a lawn stretches toward a row of identical houses, each one separated from the next by a low hedge or a chain-link fence, each one holding its own quiet interior world behind curtained glass. The neighbourhood is still. It is mid-morning. The children are at school. The husband is at the office. The dishes from breakfast have been washed and dried and placed back in the cupboard in the right order, in the right direction, facing the right way. And the woman stands at the counter. She is not rushing. She is not weeping. She's simply standing, one hand resting on the edge of the sink, looking out at the yard, at the elm tree that drops its leaves each autumn onto the grass she does not mow, at the pale blue sky above it, empty and wide and going nowhere in particular. In the cabinet above the stove, behind the aspirin and the vitamin tablets and the small brown bottle of cough syrup, there is another bottle. It is red. Its contents are red too, small capsules smooth and oval, the colour of a sunset seen through smoked glass. They are called Seconal, and tonight, as she has done for the past several months, she will take one. She will fill a small glass with water at this same sink, tilt her head back, and swallow it down. And within the hour, the hum of the refrigerator will grow softer, the house will grow warmer, and she will sleep. This is a story about that sleep, about the world that made it necessary, about the women who lived inside it, and the little red capsule that promised them peace when peace felt very far away. Settle in. Let your breathing slow. You are safe here, in this quiet kitchen, in this quiet year, in this soft and complicated world. If you enjoy listening to sleep stories like this one, stories that carry you gently through history, please consider subscribing. I post new stories every week, and there is always another world waiting for you just on the other side of sleep. Let us begin at the beginning, which is to say, let us begin in a suburb. Not any particular suburb, though you might recognise it if you have ever driven through one, that particular geometry of post-war American life, where the streets curve gently, rather than intersecting at hard right angles, as though the planners believed that a soft bend in the road might soften something in the people who lived along it. The lawns are green. The trees are young, planted only a decade ago when the development was new, their trunks still slender, their roots still finding their way through the clay and fill dirt that lies beneath the turf. The houses are modest in size, but tidy in presentation, each one a variation on the same basic theme: a front door, a picture window, a garage, a driveway, a mailbox at the end of the walk. It is the kind of neighbourhood that photographs well. That is not a small thing in 1957. To photograph well is to participate in the national story, the story that America is telling itself, and telling the world about what life can look like when order is restored after chaos, when soldiers come home and marry their sweethearts and build something permanent from the rubble of uncertainty. The woman who lives at the house we are visiting, let's call her Margaret, though her name could be Carol or Nancy or Joan, or any of a dozen other names that were common in that decade. Margaret woke this morning at 6:15. Not because an alarm sounded, though there is an alarm clock on her husband's side of the bed, a round-faced West clock with a luminous dial she can read in the dark. She woke because her body has learned to wake at that hour. Because breakfast must be made by 7, when Richard comes downstairs, and the children, 2 of them, a boy of 9 and a girl of 7, must be dressed and fed and sent out the door by 8:15, or they will be late for school and a letter will come home, and letters coming home are the kind of thing that causes a certain look to cross Richard's face at dinner, a look that does not require words. So, Margaret wakes at 6:15. She moves quietly through the bedroom, gathering her housecoat from the hook on the back of the door, stepping softly across the hall to the bathroom, where she washes her face with cold water and looks at herself in the mirror for a moment, just a moment, before reaching for her lipstick. Even in the morning, before the day has properly started, there are standards to maintain. This is not vanity. It is something closer to armour. Downstairs, she fills the percolator with water and measures out the coffee grounds with a level spoon. Richard prefers it strong and sets it on the burner. While the coffee begins its slow, fragrant climb toward readiness, she lays the table. 2 cups, 2 plates. The children eat at the counter on school mornings, perched on the stools that Richard installed himself last spring, a project that had taken 3 weekends and a great deal of muttering, but which he was quietly proud of afterward. The stools are yellow. Margaret chose the colour. She had been pleased with the choice for about a week, and then the pleasure faded, the way pleasure from small household decisions tends to fade, leaving behind only the object itself, which is just a thing that exists now in the kitchen, occupying space. The coffee is ready. She paused. She hears Richard's footsteps on the stairs. The third step always creaks. She has known it for 6 years, and she turns and smiles when he enters, and he nods and takes his seat and opens the newspaper she has placed beside his plate, and the morning begins in earnest. It is not an unhappy morning. That is an important thing to understand. Margaret does not hate her kitchen, or her husband, or her life. She does not experience her days as a series of imprisonments, though certain writers of that decade are beginning to use language that sounds very much like that, language that will eventually find its way into a book published in 1963 that will change the way American women speak about themselves and their lives. That book has not been written yet. Its author, a woman named Betty Friedan, is at this moment living a life that is not entirely unlike Margaret's, gathering observations, making notes, searching for words to describe something that feels real but remains stubbornly difficult to name, the problem that has no name. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, for now it is morning, and the coffee is hot, and the children have come downstairs in their pyjamas and must be redirected upstairs to dress, and the day is beginning the way it always begins, with 100 small requirements arranged in sequence like beads on a string, and Margaret moves through them with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this so many times that the actions themselves have become nearly automatic. She does not need to think about how to make the beds. She does not need to think about folding the laundry or wiping down the counters, or organising the pantry or calling the school about the permission slip that needs to be signed by Friday. Her hands know these things. Her body knows them. Her mind is free to wander, which is sometimes a blessing and sometimes precisely the opposite. This is the paradox at the centre of the life that Margaret and hundreds of thousands of women like her is living. She's been given every material comfort that her mother's generation struggled toward. Running water, hot and cold, a washing machine with a wringer attachment, a refrigerator large enough to hold a week's worth of food, a vacuum cleaner that is genuinely efficient rather than merely aspirational, a neighbourhood that is safe and clean and filled with other families in similar circumstances, children who are, by any reasonable measure, healthy and adequately loved, and progressing normally through childhood. And yet, there is this thing, this low hum beneath the days, like the refrigerator's hum but internal, located somewhere in the chest or behind the eyes. A feeling that does not have a clean label. Not sadness exactly, though it can look like sadness from the outside, and sometimes it tips into sadness at the edges of the day, in the late afternoon before dinner, in the early morning before the coffee has taken hold. Not anxiety, though it can feel like anxiety in the moments when she tries to locate its source and cannot find it. It is more like absence, like a drawer that should contain something important, but when you open it, you find only the liner paper, slightly yellowed at the corners, undisturbed. Margaret's doctor, a kind man named Dr. Hartley, who has a golf trophy on his office shelf and a framed photograph of his family on his desk, has heard variations of this description from many of his patients. He listens carefully. He nods. He has a sympathetic face and a thoughtful manner, and he genuinely wants to help. He asks about sleep. Margaret tells him that she wakes in the night, sometimes at 2 or 3 in the morning, and lies in the darkness with her eyes open, unable to locate the thought that woke her, unable to return to the sleep that has slipped away like water through her fingers. Dr. Hartley nods again. He has a prescription pad on his desk. He reaches for it. There is a medication, he says, that many of his patients have found helpful. It is very effective. It is safe in the doses he is prescribing. It will help us sleep, and sleeping better will help with the other thing too, the unnamed low hum, because so much of how we feel during the day is connected to how well we have slept. This is medically sound advice. He is not wrong about the connection between sleep and mood. He is operating within the best understanding available to medicine in 1957. He writes the name on the prescription slip in his precise doctor's handwriting. Seconal. Margaret takes the slip. She thanks him. She drives to the pharmacy on Main Street and hands the slip to the pharmacist. a man who fills dozens of prescriptions for this same medication every week, whose shelves hold rows of the small red capsules in their amber bottles, each one labelled with the patient's name and the dosage and the instruction. Take 1 capsule at bedtime as needed for sleep. She brings the bottle home. She puts it in the cabinet above the stove behind the aspirin and the vitamins. She makes dinner. She helps the children with their homework. She watches an hour of television with Richard, a western, which he prefers, then half an episode of a variety show before he says he's tired and goes upstairs. She washes the dinner dishes. She wipes down the counter. She turns off the kitchen light. Then she opens the cabinet. She takes out the bottle. She shakes 1 small red capsule into her palm and holds it for a moment in the lamplight from the hallway. This smooth ellipse the colour of a dried poppy, and she fills a glass with water and she swallows it down. Then she goes upstairs to bed. And somewhere in the 20 minutes that follow, something shifts. The edges of things soften. The hum quiets. The space behind her eyes, which has been faintly bright all day with the low-grade electricity of things to do and things undone and things that cannot be named, begins to dim. Her body, which has been performing its careful competence since 6:15 this morning, begins to release its grip on itself. And Margaret sleeps. Not a restless sleep. Not the kind of sleep that skims the surface of rest without quite reaching the deep place where repair happens. The Seconal carries her down, gently, almost tenderly, like a hand placed between the shoulder blades, guiding her downward through the layers. Her breathing slows. Her hands uncurl on the coverlet. The house settles around her, contracting slightly in the night air, making its small sounds, the tick of the water heater, the soft creak of the floorboards as the temperature drops. Outside, the suburb is quiet. Every house holds its sleeping inhabitants. Every bedroom contains its particular dark. And in the cabinet above the stove in the yellow linoleum kitchen, the amber bottle sits and waits for tomorrow night. When Margaret will open it again, this is how it begins, not with drama, not with crisis, but with a small red capsule and a good night's sleep in a quiet house, in a suburb where everything looks perfectly fine. To understand what Seconal was doing inside Margaret's body on those quiet evenings, it helps to travel back a little further, not to the 1950s, but to the 1860s, to a laboratory in Germany where a chemist named Adolf von Baer was working with urea and malonic acid, 2 relatively unremarkable compounds that, when combined under the right conditions, produce something remarkable. He called it barbituric acid. The name has a history of its own. Some accounts suggest it was named for a woman named Barbara, though the precise Barbara in question has been disputed by historians of chemistry for well over a century, which tells you something about how stories accrete around scientific discoveries, the human need to attach a face and a name to even the most abstract of chemical events. Barbituric acid itself, in its original form, had no particular medical usefulness. It was a starting point, a molecular scaffold upon which other structures could be built. And built they were, over the following decades, by a succession of chemists who recognized that modifications to the basic barbituric acid structure could produce compounds with powerful effects on the human nervous system. By 1903, the first medically useful barbiturate barbital was being marketed in Germany under the trade name Veronal. It was a sleep aid. It worked. Patients who had spent years lying awake in the darkness, who had tried warm milk and valerian root and whiskey and prayer and every folk remedy their grandmothers had offered, found that a dose of Veronal at bedtime carried them into unconsciousness with a reliability that felt almost miraculous. The barbiturates spread across the early 20th century like light across a room when someone opens a curtain. New variants appeared with reassuring frequency, phenobarbital in 1912, which would prove so useful for controlling epileptic seizures that it is still prescribed today. More than a century later, amobarbital, butabarbital, pentobarbital, each one a variation on the theme, each one occupying a slightly different position on the spectrum between mild sedation and deep unconsciousness. And then, in 1928, a compound called secobarbital was synthesized. It was patented by Eli Lilly and Company and brought to market under a name chosen for its color and its clean pharmaceutical sound, Seconal. The red color was not accidental. Eli Lilly's chemists had dyed the gelatin capsule deliberately, a piece of branding that was also, in a subtle way, a piece of psychology. Red, in the pharmacological lexicon of the mid-20th century, had come to signify potency, speed, action. When you took a red capsule, you knew something was happening. The colour communicated urgency and effect in a way that a plain white tablet could not. Seconal's red capsules became so distinctive that the pills acquired a street name that persisted for decades. Red devils, red birds, reds. But in the late 1940s and through the 1950s, that particular lexicon, the language of drug culture and recreational use, had not yet attached itself to Seconal in the American mainstream. In the mainstream, Seconal was simply what your doctor prescribed when you told him you weren't sleeping. It was medicine. It lived in the cabinet with the aspirin. What it was doing, chemically, was this. Seconal belongs to the class of compounds known as central nervous system depressants. When a capsule dissolves in the stomach and the secobarbital enters the bloodstream, it travels to the brain, where it binds to receptors for a neurotransmitter called gamma-aminobutyric acid, GABA in the shorthand. GABA is the brain's primary inhibitory neurotransmitter. Its job, in simple terms, is to slow things down, to quiet the signal, to turn down the volume on the electrical chatter that runs constantly through the neural architecture of the waking brain. Seconal made GABA more effective. By binding to the GABA receptors, it enhanced the inhibitory signal, made the quieting effect stronger, extended it, deepened it. The result, in the person who had swallowed the capsule, was a progressive layered descent into relaxation. First, the edges of anxiety blunted, then the muscles released their habitual tension, the clenched jaw, the tightened shoulders, the subtle bracing that many people carry through their waking hours without ever being fully aware of it. Then the thoughts slowed and became less adhesive, less likely to snag on the anxieties and plans and regrets that tend to keep the mind circling when the body is trying to rest. And then sleep, reliable, deep, chemically assisted sleep. The onset was relatively fast, typically between 15 and 30 minutes after ingestion, depending on whether the person had eaten recently and how quickly their particular metabolism processed the compound. The duration was substantial. 6 to 8 hours of sleep was common, sometimes longer. This was one of the things that distinguished Seconal from some of its barbiturate relatives, which acted either more quickly and wore off sooner, or acted more slowly and lingered into the following day, leaving the user foggy and slow through the morning. Seconal occupied what seemed to the medicine of the early 1950s like a therapeutic sweet spot. Fast enough to be reassuring, long enough to be genuinely restorative, with a duration that, in most patients at standard doses, did not extend so far into the next day that it significantly impaired function. Or, so it appeared, there was something else that the medicine of the 1950s understood. But perhaps understood less completely than it believed, the phenomenon of tolerance. Barbiturates, including Seconal, are drugs to which the human body adapts with uncomfortable efficiency. The nervous system is not a passive recipient of chemical signals. It responds to them. It calibrates. When a receptor is repeatedly flooded with a compound that enhances its inhibitory action, the system eventually adjusts, downregulating the number of receptors, altering its sensitivity, finding a new baseline that accounts for the presence of the drug. The practical consequence of this adjustment is that the dose that worked beautifully on the first night produces slightly less effect on the 30th night and considerably less on the 90th. The sleep that came so readily in the early weeks of using Seconal becomes harder to achieve at the same dose after months of regular use. And the solution that felt entirely logical to the patient experiencing this erosion of effect, and that doctors often endorsed, was to increase the dose, to take not 1 red capsule but 1.5, to take them a little earlier in the evening, to allow more time for the effect to build. The other consequence of tolerance was the mirror phenomenon, withdrawal. When a system has adjusted its baseline to account for the presence of a drug that suppresses its activity, removing the drug suddenly leaves the system unbalanced in the opposite direction. Overexcited, hyperactive. In the case of barbiturate withdrawal, this could manifest as anxiety, insomnia, that was far worse than the original complaint that had led to the prescription, tremors, and in severe cases seizures. Barbiturate withdrawal is a genuinely dangerous medical event, more physically dangerous in many cases than withdrawal from opioids. None of this was secret information in the 1950s. The medical literature contained case reports of barbiturate dependence. Individual physicians had observed the pattern in their patients, the dose escalation, the difficulty stopping, the physical symptoms when the medication was withdrawn. There were voices within the medical community raising concerns about the widespread prescribing of barbiturates to patients with what we might today call subclinical anxiety and insomnia. But those voices existed within a system that was also receiving, with great regularity and considerable sophistication, the marketing communications of the pharmaceutical industry. Eli Lilly was not the only company with barbiturate products on the market by the mid-1950s. The category was crowded and competitive, and advertising in medical journals, direct marketing to physicians, and the distribution of sample products were all standard practices. The message those marketing efforts conveyed was consistent. These medications are safe, they are effective, and your patients need them. Your patients specifically, your female patients. Because it was women, overwhelmingly, who were being prescribed barbiturates in the post-war decades. The prescription data from this period, analysed retrospectively by medical historians, shows a stark gender disparity. Women received barbiturate prescriptions at roughly twice the rate of men. Some studies suggest the ratio was higher still. This disparity reflected a confluence of factors. Women sought medical care more frequently than men in this period, partly because of the reproductive health needs that brought them into contact with doctors at regular intervals. Women were more likely to report the kind of diffuse, hard-to-locate symptoms: fatigue, difficulty sleeping, tension, a general sense of malaise, that sat at the medical borderline between physical illness and what the medicine of the time often labelled, with varying degrees of precision, as ___, quote __0 __. And doctors, almost all of whom were men, were operating within a cultural framework that understood female emotionality as a clinical category requiring management. There is something important to say carefully here. The women who went to their doctors and described their symptoms were not fabricating those symptoms. The fatigue was real. The insomnia was real. The low hum of unnamed distress that Margaret stands with in her kitchen, that she carries through her day of perfectly organised tasks, that surfaces in the 2 a.m. wakings when she lies in the darkness unable to name what is troubling her. All of that is real. The question that the medicine of the 1950s largely failed to ask was not whether the symptoms were genuine, but whether a prescription was the right response to them. But we are not in the position of asking that question from outside the decade. With the benefit of hindsight, we are inside it, inside the yellow kitchen, inside the quiet suburb, inside the world as it is understood by everyone living in it: the doctors, the pharmacists, the advertising copywriters, the women themselves. From inside that world, the prescription makes a kind of sense. You're not sleeping. There is a medication that helps you sleep. Your doctor has given it to you. You take it. And it works. For a while, it works very, very well. And that is part of the story too. Not just the dangers that accumulated in the years of widespread barbiturate use, but the genuine relief that the medication provided. For women living under the particular pressures of mid-century American domesticity, a reliable night of deep sleep was not a small thing. It was, in some cases, the difference between functioning and not functioning, between getting through the day and not getting through the day. We should hold that truth alongside the other truths. The relief was real, the sleep was real. And the amber bottle in the cabinet above the stove was, for many women, the most reliable thing in a life full of things that required managing. Let the thought of that cabinet settle for a moment. The amber glass, slightly warm from the heat of the kitchen. The small rattle of capsules when the bottle moves. The red of them, visible through the translucent container, the colour of something precious kept in a vessel designed to protect it from light. There is something almost tender about it from this distance. A woman standing at her kitchen counter, reaching for the thing that will let her rest. Let that image hold you for a moment as we breathe slowly here together, and then let it drift, and let us move forward through the story. To understand why so many women were reaching for that amber bottle, it helps to understand the world that placed them in the kitchen in the first place. Not in a punishing way, not to assign blame or build toward outrage, but simply to see it clearly, the way you might look through a window at a landscape you have driven past many times but never really stopped to examine. The post-war American suburb was, in one sense, a genuine achievement. It was the material expression of a promise that America had been making to its working and middle classes since the New Deal, the promise that prosperity was real, that it could be distributed broadly, that a man with a steady job and a modest income could provide his family with a home, a car, a washing machine, a yard. In the years immediately following World War II, the fulfillment of that promise was not metaphorical. It was literal and rapid. William Levitt's development company was building Levittown in New York in 1947, offering identical Cape Cod houses at prices accessible to veterans using their GI Bill benefits. 18,000 homes in 4 years, then another Levittown in Pennsylvania, then dozens of imitators across the country. The same logic applied to different geographies. Mass production applied to housing, the efficiency of the assembly line redirected toward the construction of community. Into these communities poured the young families of post-war America. The men were veterans, or they were the slightly younger brothers of veterans who had grown up in the shadow of the war without fighting in it. The women were often women who had worked during the war years, in factories, in offices, in the essential support roles that kept the domestic economy functioning while the men were overseas, and who had been, with varying degrees of voluntariness, guided back out of the workforce and into the home when the veterans returned. This transition was engineered as much culturally as economically. The magazines, the films, the advertising campaigns of the late 1940s and early 1950s participated in a massive recalibration of what femininity was supposed to mean and what it was supposed to require. The image of Rosie the Riveter, capable, proud, useful in the world outside the home, was quietly set aside. In its place came a new figure, the housewife, the homemaker. The woman whose contribution to the national project was to maintain a comfortable and beautiful home, to raise children well, to support her husband's career by ensuring that his domestic environment was orderly and welcoming. This figure was not presented as a compromise or a demotion. She was presented as an aspiration. The magazines, Good Housekeeping, Ladies' Home Journal, McCall's, ran articles and photographic spreads showing immaculate kitchens, carefully arranged dining tables, women in shirtwaist dresses with their hair perfectly set, smiling at their appliances with an expression that communicated genuine and uncomplicated contentment. The advertising that filled the pages around those articles was selling the same story. A new refrigerator, a better vacuum cleaner, a more effective laundry detergent, each one a piece of the larger picture. The domestic life as a space of purposeful activity and well-earned satisfaction. Women read these magazines in very large numbers. They absorbed the image. Many of them also, in the privacy of their own minds, measured their own experience against it and found the measurement uncomfortable in ways they could not fully articulate. Because the gap between the magazine image and the daily reality was real, even if it was rarely named. The magazine kitchen was always clean at the moment of the photograph. The real kitchen was clean for approximately 45 minutes after it was cleaned before the children returned from school, and the process began again. The magazine housewife was smiling because she was in a magazine. The real housewife was, well, she was whatever she was on any given afternoon, which was not always smiling, and not always sure what she was feeling or why. Sociologists studying this period later identified a pattern they called role strain. The psychological stress that arises when the demands of a social role exceed the individual's capacity to meet them, or when the role's requirements conflict with the individual's own needs and desires. The housewife role of the 1950s was, by many measures, an extraordinarily demanding one. It required the management of a complex domestic enterprise, the procurement, preparation, and preservation of food, the cleaning and maintenance of a home, the supervision of children's education, health, social development, and moral formation, the management of the family's social relationships and community obligations, and the ongoing invisible labour of being pleasant, available, and emotionally sustaining to a husband who returned each evening from the separate and legitimised stress of the paid workplace. None of this labour was paid. Very little of it was publicly acknowledged as labour. The cultural narrative surrounding it was one of natural vocation. Women were suited to these tasks by nature, by instinct, by the particular shape of their emotional intelligence and their relational capacities. To find the work exhausting or unfulfilling was to find fault with yourself, with your own adequacy as a woman, not with the structure of the role. This is a very particular kind of psychological trap. When the source of your distress is invisible, when the framework you live inside tells you that your distress is a personal failing rather than a reasonable response to a genuine constraint, you cannot address it directly. You cannot name it to your husband or your doctor or your neighbour because you do not have the language for it, and even if you did, the cultural reception would be skeptical. You are well fed, you are housed, your children are healthy. What precisely do you have to complain about? The answer, which Betty Friedan would articulate in 1963 in The Feminine Mystique, was the loss of a self, the loss of a life outside the self, the foreclosure of the question of what else you might have been, or might still become. Not material deprivation, but existential narrowing. The feeling of being a person whose interior dimensions exceed the available space. But again, we are in 1957, and that book has not been written. The language is not yet available. What Margaret has is her kitchen, her children, her husband, her carefully maintained home, and the low, persistent hum that she carries in her chest and cannot name. And she has Dr. Hartley, who listens carefully and writes on his prescription pad. Dr. Hartley is not a villain in this story. Let us be clear about that, because clarity is important, and because assigning villain status to historical figures is a way of avoiding the more difficult and more instructive recognition that well-meaning people operating within flawed systems can cause harm without intending to, without knowing that they are. Dr. Hartley genuinely wants to help his patient. He genuinely believes that the medication he is prescribing is safe and appropriate. He has been given this belief by his medical education, by the pharmaceutical representatives who visit his office with samples and literature, and by the general consensus of his professional community. He has also been given it by a broader cultural understanding of what women need and what women are. In the medicine of the 1950s, women's psychological and emotional symptoms were often interpreted through a lens that combined genuine care with a framework of female fragility. The assumption that women were constitutionally more susceptible to nervous complaints, more easily overwhelmed by the ordinary stresses of life, more in need of medical management of their interior states. This assumption was not stated unkindly. It was simply there, like wallpaper, so familiar as to be effectively invisible. Within that framework, prescribing Seconal to a woman who reports insomnia and general malaise is not negligence. It is responsive medicine. It is giving the patient what she needs, and in the short term it gives her exactly what she needs: sleep. Genuine, deep, restoring sleep, in a life where the opportunity for rest is structured entirely around the needs of others. The pill does what the pill is designed to do. Let us not lose sight of that, even as we follow the story toward the places it eventually leads. For now, the story is still in its early chapters. The amber bottle is relatively new. The dose is what the prescription says. The sleep it delivers is reliable, and the mornings after are clear enough. A slight heaviness in the first hour after waking, a warmth in the limbs, but nothing that a cup of coffee does not resolve. Margaret makes breakfast. She sends the children to school. She makes the beds and wipes the counters and plans the dinner and moves through her day with the practiced efficiency of a person who knows her tasks so thoroughly that performing them leaves a portion of the mind free to wander. The mind wanders. It notices the elm tree in the yard dropping its leaves. It notices the quality of the light in the late afternoon. The way it comes through the kitchen window at an angle that makes the linoleum look golden for exactly 40 minutes before the sun moves on. It notices the sound the children make when they return from school, that particular tumult of voices and backpacks and requests, and the way the house changes temperature and character when they arrive, as though it has been waiting for them all day in a kind of suspended quiet. These are not unhappy observations, but they are also not enough. There is something else that the mind reaches toward and does not find, some territory that the day does not provide access to, some room in the interior house that remains locked. At night, when the house is finally quiet and the day's requirements have been discharged and Richard is asleep beside her, Margaret lies in the darkness and reaches toward that territory, and cannot find it, and the reaching keeps her awake. Until she opens the cabinet, until she fills the glass. Until the small red capsule dissolves in her stomach and the warmth begins to spread and the reaching slows and the darkness becomes, at last, a place she can rest inside. Breathe slowly with me here. Let the story settle around you like a blanket that is slightly heavy, comfortably heavy, the kind of weight that is reassuring rather than oppressive. We are inside the decade now. We can feel its textures, the linoleum and the percolator coffee, and the particular quality of a mid-century American morning. We are not rushing anywhere. The story will unfold at its own pace, and there is nowhere to be but here, inside it, following these quiet lives through their quiet days. Let your breathing slow a little more. Good. Let us continue. There is a particular kind of advertisement that appeared in American medical journals throughout the 1950s, and if you were to look at one now, really look at it, the way you might examine an artifact in a museum case, turning it over in your mind to understand what it reveals about the world that produced it, you would find it simultaneously fascinating and unsettling in the way that only things from the recent past can be, things close enough to recognize but far enough away to see clearly. The advertisement might show a woman. She's perhaps 35 years old, though she could be younger. The decade's ideal of femininity skewed toward a kind of ageless presentability that resisted precise dating. She's sitting at a kitchen table or standing at a window or occasionally lying in a bed with her hands folded neatly on the coverlet above her, eyes open and directed towards some middle distance that the viewer cannot see. Her expression is the advertisement's crucial element. It is not an expression of pain, exactly, though it contains something adjacent to pain. It is a look of mild but persistent difficulty, of a person who is trying very hard to manage something that is not quite manageable. Beside her, or above her, or arranged in the clinical white space that surrounds her image, are words. The words do several things at once. They name her condition, in language calibrated to be medical enough to convey authority, and accessible enough to be understood by the busy physician reading during a lunch break. They describe her symptoms in terms that would be recognizable to any doctor who had spent time listening to female patients in the post-war decade. Fatigue, insomnia, tension, irritability, a vague sense of being unable to cope with the ordinary demands of daily life. And then they offer the solution, clean and confident, and entirely without ambiguity. This medication will help her. The pharmaceutical industry of the 1950s was not inventing the problem that Seconal and its competitors addressed. The problem was real, but the industry was doing something more sophisticated than simply responding to a pre-existing medical need. It was participating in the construction of a clinical category, the anxious, sleepless, emotionally fragile housewife, and simultaneously marketing the solution to that category with a precision and a consistency that shaped how doctors understood their female patients, how those patients understood themselves, and what responses seemed appropriate when a woman sat down in an examination room and described the low hum beneath her days. The pharmaceutical marketing of this era was directed almost entirely at physicians. Direct-to-consumer advertising for prescription medications was not yet common practice. That transformation of the marketing landscape would come later, in the 1980s and 1990s, when regulatory changes opened the possibility of television and magazine advertisements addressed directly to patients. In the 1950s, the target audience was the doctor. The tool was the medical journal advertisement, the pharmaceutical company representative who visited offices with samples and literature, and the sponsored educational events that populated the medical conference calendar. These tools were deployed with considerable sophistication. The representatives who visited doctors' offices were trained to present their products in the most favourable light, to answer objections with prepared responses, to build relationships with physicians that made the prescription of their company's products feel like a natural extension of a collegial trust. The journal advertisements were designed by people who understood that the physician reading them was a busy professional who needed to absorb the key message quickly, that the illustration and the headline and the tagline had to do most of the work before the reader's attention moved on to the next page. Eli Lilly, which held the patent on Seconal, was a significant and sophisticated player in this landscape. The company's representatives visited medical offices throughout the country. Their promotional materials emphasized the drug's effectiveness and its safety profile, noting that at therapeutic doses it was well tolerated and that adverse effects were uncommon. The clinical studies cited in the promotional literature were real studies, conducted under real research protocols, and their findings were accurately reported. Within the standards of the time, the marketing was honest. What it did not emphasize, what the marketing of virtually no barbiturate product of this era emphasized, was the question of long-term use. The studies that demonstrated Seconal's effectiveness typically measured outcomes over periods of days to weeks. They established that the drug worked, that it was tolerated, that patients slept better while taking it than they had before. They did not follow those patients for months or years to examine what happened when the drug was continued beyond the acute period. when the dose began to creep upward, when the patient who'd been prescribed 1 capsule at bedtime was, a year later, taking 2, and still not sleeping as well as she had slept in the early weeks of the prescription. This was not an unusual research design for the period. The tools and the methodologies for studying long-term medication effects were less developed than they would later become, the regulatory requirements for demonstrating long-term safety less stringent. The Food and Drug Administration of the 1950s operated under a framework established by the 1938 Federal Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act, which required manufacturers to demonstrate that new drugs were safe before marketing them, but interpreted safety primarily in terms of acute toxicity, the question of whether a drug caused immediate identifiable harm at therapeutic doses, not the more complex and longitudinal question of what it did to a person who took it every night for 2 years. The thalidomide disaster of the early 1960s would eventually prompt significant strengthening of drug safety regulation. The 1962 Kefauver-Harris Amendment, adding requirements for proof of efficacy and more rigorous safety testing before approval. But in the mid-1950s, the regulatory landscape was less demanding, and the pharmaceutical industry operated in the space that regulation defined. Into this space, Seconal and its relatives, amobarbital, pentobarbital, phenobarbital, and later the non-barbiturate but pharmacologically similar meprobamate, marketed as Milltown and introduced in 1955, found an enormous and receptive market. Milltown deserves a particular mention here because its arrival in the mid-decade represents something of a cultural inflection point. While Seconal was prescribed primarily as a sleep aid, Milltown was marketed explicitly for daytime anxiety, for the management of the nervous tension that accompanied daily life. It was, in the terminology of the era, a tranquilizer, a very successful one. Milltown became, briefly, famous in a way that prescription medications rarely become famous. It was mentioned in newspaper columns, it was joked about at dinner parties. It appeared in magazine articles with titles that treated it with the same fond familiarity one might apply to a reliable friend. Have you tried the happy pill, the anxiety cure that fits in your pocket? Milton Berle joked about it on television. The drug's name entered casual conversation as a shorthand for the management of modern anxiety, and its success demonstrated, to the pharmaceutical industry, to the medical community, to the general public, that there was an enormous appetite for chemical solutions to the psychological difficulties of contemporary life. This appetite was not evenly distributed across the population. Women consumed the tranquilizers and sleep aids of the 1950s at rates substantially higher than men. The Rolling Stones would eventually memorialize this disparity in a song released in 1966, their lyric about a woman running to the doctor to get her little helpers capturing in a few words what took sociologists pages of academic prose to describe: the little helpers, the pills in the cabinet, the chemical management of the emotional life of the American woman. But let us return to the more intimate scale, because it is at the intimate scale that the story lives most vividly. Return to Margaret's kitchen. Return to the amber bottle. Something has changed in the 6 months since the prescription was first filled. Not dramatically, not in the way that change announces itself, more gradually the way water level rises in a room you've been standing in for a long time. You notice it at some point and realize it has been rising for a while. The dose that works so reliably in the first weeks now produces sleep that is slightly lighter, slightly shorter, the edges a little less soft. Margaret mentioned this to Dr. Hartley at her appointment last month. He nodded. He adjusted the prescription. 1.5 capsules at bedtime. Still a therapeutic dose, still within acceptable parameters. And it works again, for now. The familiar warmth and descent, the reliable crossing over into the dark and restoring country of sleep. She is grateful for it. She does not think of it as a warning sign because she has not been told to think of it that way. She thinks of it as what it appears to be, a small adjustment to maintain the effectiveness of a helpful medication. This is the nature of tolerance. It arrives not as a catastrophe but as a quiet renegotiation. The terms of the original agreement adjusted incrementally until the original terms are barely recognizable. The person inside the negotiation rarely sees it clearly, because each individual adjustment is small, each one feels reasonable in the moment, each one is endorsed by the physician who has been managing the process. Only from the outside, only from the distance of time does the trajectory become legible. We are watching it from that distance now. We can see the arc of it, the first prescription, the early relief, the tolerance, the dose adjustment, the further tolerance, the further adjustment, playing out across thousands of kitchens in thousands of suburbs, in thousands of amber bottles behind thousands of cabinet doors. We can see it with a clarity that the women living inside it could not access, and this clarity asks something of us. Not judgment, not condescension, not the comfortable superiority of the person who knows how the story ends looking back at the person who does not. It asks something closer to compassion, the particular compassion owed to someone doing their best inside a system they did not design and cannot fully see. Let that compassion settle in the chest where the heart is. Let it be warm there. We are going to carry it with us through the rest of the story, and it will make the story easier to hold. Breathe. The kitchen is quiet. The elm tree is bare now. It is December, and the yard holds the silver-grey light of a winter afternoon. The grass flattened by frost, the hedge between the neighbouring properties skeletal and precise. Inside, the furnace has come on, and the house is warm with its particular indoor warmth, the smell of the morning's coffee still faint in the air, underneath the newer smell of something beginning on the stove. It is almost time for the children to come home. Margaret has 40 minutes, and she's using them to sit at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, doing nothing in particular, which is itself a kind of luxury. The unscheduled pause in the middle of the scheduled day. The amber bottle is in its cabinet. She does not think about it in this moment. It is simply there, like the aspirin and the vitamins, like everything else that lives in its appointed place in this carefully ordered house. We will leave her there, in her 40 minutes of quiet, the tea cooling in the cup, the winter light moving slowly across the linoleum floor. And we will move forward through the decade to look at the larger picture, the industry, the culture, the medicine, the women, and to understand how all of these things fitted together to produce the particular world that Margaret inhabits. The examination room in Dr. Hartley's office is painted a pale green, not the aggressive mint of an institutional corridor, but a softer, more considered shade, the colour of new leaves in early spring. Someone made a deliberate choice about that colour, a small act of environmental care aimed at making the room feel less clinical, more reassuring. There is a framed print on one wall, a landscape with a river and a wooden bridge and trees in autumn colour, the kind of image that occupies the middle space between decoration and comfort, without making any particular aesthetic demand on the viewer. The examination table has a paper cover that crinkles when a patient moves. Doctor. Hartley comes into the room already reading the chart. His nurse has prepared it, pulling the manila folder from the filing cabinet and placing it in the slot outside the door, so that by the time he enters he has a 30-second preview of why the person in the room has come to see him today. The chart contains dates and diagnoses and medication records, a condensed biography of the body rendered in medical shorthand. He is, by any measure, a good physician. He completed his medical education at a respected institution, trained under clinicians whose standards were high, and has been practicing in this suburb for 11 years. He knows his patients, not just their files, but their families, their circumstances, the particular texture of their lives as they have been disclosed to him over years of appointments. He remembers that Margaret's older child had pneumonia 2 winters ago, that Richard had his appendix removed in 1953, that the family moved here from Ohio, and that Margaret sometimes mentions, in the casual way of someone mentioning something that has not quite been processed, that she misses the landscape there, the rolling hills, the particular quality of the sky over flat farmland. He knows these things, and they inform his care. He is not an automaton. He is not callous. He is a man of his time, practicing medicine as his time understands it, within the frameworks that his training and his culture and his professional community have given him, and his time understands female patients in a specific way. The history of medicine's relationship with women's psychological and emotional symptoms is long and not always illuminating. The 19th century gave us hysteria, a diagnostic category so elastic that it could accommodate almost any symptom a woman presented with. From fainting to paralysis to what we would today recognize as depression or anxiety or psychosis, all of it attributed to some dysfunction of the female reproductive system and treated with everything from rest cures to hydrotherapy to, in the most extreme cases, surgical interventions. The 20th century retired the term hysteria, but did not entirely retire the conceptual framework it represented. The understanding of women as constitutionally more susceptible to nervous and emotional disturbance than men, more in need of medical management of their interior states. In the 1950s, this framework had been refined and professionalized. The language was more careful, the diagnostic categories more specific. A woman presenting with persistent insomnia, fatigue, and what she described as a vague inability to feel entirely well was not diagnosed with hysteria. She was given a more precise-sounding label, anxiety neurosis perhaps, or psychophysiological reaction, and offered a treatment plan that reflected the best understanding of her condition available to the medicine of the decade. That treatment plan, in a great many cases, included a prescription for Seconal or one of its barbiturate relatives. Sometimes it also included a referral to a psychiatrist or psychotherapist if the symptoms were sufficiently severe or if the physician had reason to believe that talking therapy might be beneficial. More often, in the rapid turnover reality of a busy general practice, the prescription was the primary response. It was effective, it was quick, it fit within the time constraints of a 10-minute appointment, and it sent the patient home with something concrete in her hand, which is not an insignificant thing. The prescription is a physical token of care, evidence that the problem has been recognized and a response has been initiated. What the prescription did not do was address the question of why the woman was not sleeping. Not at the level beneath the symptom, not the question of what in her life was generating the tension and the fatigue and the unnamed distress that expressed itself at 2 a.m, as eyes open in the dark. That question required a different kind of conversation than 10 minutes could hold. It required a kind of listening that was not, in the 1950s, widely available within the structures of general medical practice. And it required a conceptual framework that placed the source of the woman's difficulty not inside her nervous system, as a feature of her particular physiology or psychology, but in the structure of the world she was living in. That framework existed in nascent form in the academic literature of sociology and psychology, but it had not yet reached the general practitioner's office in any form that would have been legible or actionable. So the conversation that happened between Dr. Hartley and his female patients was honest and careful within its limits, and its limits were real. He listened to what he'd been trained to hear. He offered what his training told him to offer, and his patients, who had also absorbed the cultural frameworks of their decade, who also understood their symptoms as personal rather than structural, as problems of their own nervous systems rather than symptoms of a world that was asking too much of them, received the prescription gratefully. There were women who resisted this framing, not necessarily consciously, not necessarily with political intent, but in the way that a person resists a shoe that does not quite fit, a persistent, low-level sense of wrongness that does not go away. Women who went to their doctors and were given prescriptions and went home and put the amber bottles in their cabinets and still felt, alongside the medication's real relief, that something about the solution did not match the problem. Women who talked to their neighbours over the backyard fence and found the same sense of wrongness there, reflected back. I feel it too. I don't know what it is. I thought it was just me. It was not just them. But in the absence of a framework that could name what it actually was, the prescription filled the space. And for many women, it filled it sufficiently. The sleep it delivered was genuine, and the days were more manageable when the nights were solid, and manageable was enough. Not flourishing, not thriving, but navigating. Keeping the household running, keeping the family intact, keeping the surface smooth and orderly and photographable. We might think about what that word costs, navigating. The ongoing expenditure of effort required to manage an interior state that has not been resolved but simply suppressed. The constant low-level labour of keeping the surface smooth when the thing beneath the surface remains unaddressed. That labour has a metabolic cost. Even if the decade has no language for that cost, even if it is absorbed invisibly into the category of what women are simply constituted to manage. And the Seconal manages the nighttime version of it. The sleep it delivers is real sleep, not the performance of sleep. The brain moves through its architecture, the body repairs itself, the morning comes and the woman in the bed has rested genuinely, and the day ahead is marginally more possible than it would have been on the restless surfacing sleep of unmedicated insomnia. Across town from Margaret, in a house with a different colour door and a different configuration of front yard, there is a woman named Dorothy. Dorothy's 43, older than Margaret by nearly a decade, and she has been taking Seconal for 4 years. She was prescribed it first for insomnia following a difficult menopause, a period of disrupted sleep and unpredictable sweating, and a general sense of her body operating outside its familiar parameters. Frightening in its way, the reliable machinery of the body revealing itself as not quite as reliable as she had believed. The Seconal helped, the sleep returned. The physician continued the prescription through the menopause and beyond it, because by then Dorothy's sleep without the medication was genuinely poor. Not because the menopause was still disrupting it, but because the 4 years of nightly barbiturate use had altered her sleep architecture in ways that made unmedicated sleep feel thin and shallow and insufficient. Her body had grown accustomed to the chemical descent. Without it, she lay in the darkness, and the darkness felt different. A harder kind of dark, less welcoming, the silence in it sharper. Dorothy does not know in 1957 that what she's experiencing is barbiturate dependence. Neither does her physician, not precisely. He understands that she sleeps better with the medication than without it, and this seems to him a straightforward clinical finding. She needs the medication. The possibility that the medication has itself created the need it is filling is a more complex loop than the clinical conversation of the decade has readily available tools to think through. Dorothy takes 2 capsules now, sometimes 2.5. She has her prescription renewed at each quarterly appointment. She's a good patient. She does not miss appointments, she follows the dosing instructions, she does not drink alcohol in excess, she maintains the household and attends the church women's group, and brings casseroles to neighbours when there is illness or bereavement. From the outside, she's managing perfectly well. On the nights when she is miscounted and realises at bedtime that the bottle is nearly empty, she experiences something she has learned to call restlessness, a physical agitation in the legs, a racing quality to the thoughts, a reluctance of the body to settle that is different in character from ordinary sleeplessness. She has not connected this restlessness to the medication. It has not occurred to her to make that connection. She thinks of herself as someone who simply does not sleep well without help, which is true, and she does not examine the history that produced that truth. This is the nature of the situation in 1957. Not dramatic, not self-aware, simply continuing. The prescription renewed, the bottle refilled, the nights managed, the days navigated. In the medical literature of the time, case reports of barbiturate dependence appear with increasing frequency. Individual physicians are noticing patterns. The dose escalation, the difficulty discontinuing, the physical symptoms when medication is stopped. In the psychiatric literature, papers addressing the problem of sedative dependence are being published. The information exists. It is simply not connected yet to the general practice prescription pad, not translated into the ordinary clinical conversation that happens between busy physicians and their female patients who are not sleeping. That translation is coming, but it is not here yet. For now, it is still the middle of the decade. The amber bottles are in their cabinets, the nights are managed, and the day begins again, as it always begins, with the alarm, with the coffee, with the children's voices on the stairs, with the 100 small requirements arranged in sequence like beads on a string. Close your eyes a little more, let the images soften. We are moving deeper into the evening now, into the quieter hours of the story, where the day's busyness has settled and there is only the lamplight and the low sound of the house. Let your breathing settle with it. Good. There is a particular quality to the hours between 2 and 4 in the afternoon in a suburban house when the children are at school, a quality of suspension. The morning's tasks are done, the breakfast dish is washed, the bed's made, the laundry started or finished or folded, and the afternoon's work has not yet fully assembled itself. There is a pause in the day's requirement, a gap in the schedule, and into that gap falls a quality of light and silence that has no direct equivalent in any other part of the day. Women experienced this time differently. Some used it productively, telephoning friends, working on volunteer committee materials, beginning the preparations for dinner. Some sat with a library book, escaping briefly into the interior of someone else's story. Some, like Margaret, stood at the kitchen window and looked at the yard with an expression that a passing stranger might have interpreted as sadness, but that was more accurately something else, a kind of alert stillness, the quality of a person who is paying very close attention to their own interior weather. What Margaret notices, in these afternoon pauses, is that she is tired. Not the clean fatigue of physical effort, the pleasant heaviness of muscles that have been used and are asking to rest. This is a different kind of tiredness. It is located somewhere behind the eyes and in the chest, and it does not respond to sitting down or drinking tea, though she does both of these things and they help marginally. It is the tiredness of sustained performance, the tiredness of a person who has been being someone, the good mother, the competent homemaker, the pleasant neighbour, the supportive wife, without sufficient interruption to simply be no one for a while. Psychologists studying this period would later identify this phenomenon as emotional labour, the work of managing one's own emotional expressions and states in order to fulfill the relational requirements of a role. Domestic life in the 1950s was saturated with emotional labour. The expectation that a wife and mother would maintain an emotional atmosphere in the home, calm, warm, gently cheerful, never significantly burdened, was unwritten but pervasive, embedded in the cultural expectations that arrived via the magazines and the television programs, and the conversations between neighbours that always implicitly measured the degree to which everyone was coping. Coping was the standard, not flourishing, not thriving in the sense of expanding and growing and moving towards something. Simply coping, managing the day's requirements, maintaining the household, keeping the emotional temperature of the family within acceptable ranges. The woman who was coping was succeeding. The woman who was visibly not coping was failing. This standard had a particular effect on the experience of physical and emotional symptoms. Fatigue could be disclosed to a doctor in the privacy of an examination room, but it could not easily be disclosed to a husband or a neighbour, because the disclosure carried the risk of appearing to not cope. Anxiety, the low, persistent, anxious quality that many women experience but could not name, could be mentioned to a physician as a clinical complaint, but expressing it within the social world of the neighbourhood was another matter. Requiring a level of vulnerability and an abandonment of the coping performance that the cultural climate actively discouraged. The doctor's office was therefore one of the only spaces where the performance could be partially dropped, where a woman could say, "I am not sleeping, and I feel not quite right, and there is something I cannot seem to resolve without risking her social standing, without being judged as failing to cope." The examination room held a kind of privacy that the backyard fence conversation could not offer, and women used it. They brought their symptoms to their doctors with considerable regularity, and their doctors responded with the tools they had. Inside the privacy of the home, a different kind of life was sometimes occurring than the one that was visible from the outside. Not necessarily dramatic lives, not secret dramas, not hidden scandals, though those existed too, as they always do, in any human community large enough to contain the full range of human experience. More often, simply private lives, the life that existed in the hours when no one was watching, when the performance could rest. Ruth, who lives 2 doors down from Margaret and sits with her at the PTA meetings, and waves from her driveway on the mornings when they both happen to be taking out the trash at the same time, has been taking Seconal for 2 years. She was prescribed it after the birth of her 3rd child, when the sleep disruption of a newborn combined with something that the doctor at the time noted cautiously as possible postpartum low mood, to produce an exhaustion so complete that she had spent 3 days in February unable to get out of bed before noon. The doctor had suggested rest. The doctor had also written a prescription. The rest, in the practical reality of a household with 3 children under 6, was theoretical. A rest in principle that could not be actualized because the children needed feeding and the household needed managing, and Richard was at the office and the culture did not provide for the concept of a mother taking a leave of absence from motherhood. The prescription, however, was practical. The Seconal arrived promptly at the pharmacy. The sleep it delivered was real. Ruth has learned to structure her days around it. She takes her capsule earlier than most of her neighbours. By 9 in the evening she's feeling the medication's warmth beginning to spread, the edges of things softening, the background tension in her shoulders releasing. By 10 she's in bed. By 10:15 she's asleep. She wakes at 6, sometimes 6:30, and for the first 20 minutes the world has a slightly underwater quality, not unpleasant, almost meditative, before the coffee brings everything back into full focus. She's noticed that she's sharper, quicker, more capable on the Seconal nights than she was on the sleepless nights before it. Her children get a better version of her in the mornings, a version that is not running on the raw edge of exhaustion, not depleted before the day has properly begun. This seems to her like a meaningful piece of evidence. The medication is not weakening her. It is enabling her. It is the maintenance that keeps the machine running at full capacity. This reasoning is not wrong. Exactly. The performance improvement that adequate sleep produces over inadequate sleep is real and well documented, both anecdotally and clinically. Ruth's assessment of her own functioning is accurate. She's better rested with the medication than without it, and better rest does produce better functioning. Where the reasoning is incomplete is in the question it does not ask. Why is she not sleeping without it? What is the thing that is keeping her awake in the absence of the chemical assistance? The answer, if she had the framework to pursue it, would have multiple layers. The physical layer of disrupted sleep architecture from the postpartum period and the subsequent barbiturate use. The psychological layer of sustained anxiety and emotional depletion that the decade does not quite have language for. The structural layer of a domestic arrangement that places total responsibility for childcare and household management on one person with insufficient support. None of these layers is visible to Ruth, or not fully visible. She experiences them as a single, undifferentiated reality. She does not sleep well without the medication. The medication helps. She takes the medication. The next layer. What if I didn't need to take the medication? What would need to change for that to be true? Is a question the decade is not quite ready to ask. Across the suburb, in a different configuration of homes and lives, there are women for whom the medication is not working as cleanly as it works for Margaret and Ruth. Women who have been taking it longer, at higher doses, for whom the tolerance has progressed further, and the dose adjustment has reached the point where it begins to carry its own complications. Morning grogginess that does not resolve with coffee, a slight uncertainty in the cognitive world, words taking a fraction of a second longer to arrive, the surface of thought feeling slightly muffled like music heard through a wall. These symptoms are subtle. They are easy to attribute to other causes, to the persistent tiredness that exists underneath the medicated sleep, to the ordinary cognitive burden of managing a complex household, to the diffuse fatigue that has been present for so long it has become part of the texture of ordinary life. Eleanor is one of these women, and she's further along the trajectory than Margaret or Ruth. She has been taking Seconal for 5 years, initially prescribed by one doctor, continued by another after she moved across town when her husband changed jobs. The handoff between physicians was smooth, in the sense that no one questioned the prescription. It was simply transferred. The new doctor noting it in his records and renewing it at each appointment. Eleanor's life functions. This is the remarkable thing, seen from the outside. And it is also the most invisible and most costly thing, seen from the inside. She maintains her household. She raises her children. She participates in the neighbourhood's social fabric. The church, the PTA, the bridge club on Thursday afternoons. The surface is intact. The performance of coping is sustained. But inside the performance, something is working very hard to hold it together. The medication that was supposed to restore her to her full capacity has, over 5 years of use and dose escalation, become part of the structure of that capacity. She cannot function without it, in the sense that her nervous system has adjusted its baseline to its presence, and the absence of it produces symptoms that make the ordinary demands of the day feel insurmountable. She is not failing, but she is not free. On the evenings when she opens the cabinet and finds the bottle light, when she realizes she is miscounted and there are only 2 capsules left and her next appointment is not until Thursday, she experiences something that she calls, privately, a kind of dread. Not dramatic dread, not panic. A low, settled, bodily dread, like a weather system moving in at the edge of consciousness. She will call the office first thing in the morning to ask about a refill. She knows they will accommodate her. But the knowing does not entirely quiet the dread, because the dread is not rational. It is chemical, its roots in the body rather than in the mind. This is what dependence looks like from the inside. Not dramatic, not self-destructive in the way that the word dependence tends to imply when we encounter it in conversations about addiction. Simply, a quiet restructuring of the chemistry of necessity, so gradual that the person inside it barely noticed it happening, so complete that reversing it would require a medical process that the decade has not yet developed the protocols or the will to make widely available. Let us sit with Eleanor for a moment. In her living room in the evening, the television on but not quite watched, the children in bed, her husband asleep in the armchair. The day finished. She's knitting. Her hands know the motion without supervision, the needles moving through their quiet rhythm, the soft click of them audible beneath the television's murmur. The lamplight is warm, the room is comfortable, everything is, in the surface reading, fine, and underneath the surface Eleanor is very tired, not the tiredness of this particular day, though this particular day has been long and full of its own requirements. She's tired in the deeper way, the way of someone who has been working very hard at something that does not get easier, that does not resolve, that simply continues. She finishes her row, she sets the knitting down, she gets up and goes to the kitchen, and she opens the cabinet and she takes out the bottle, and she shakes a capsule into her palm, and she looks at it for a moment in the kitchen light, this small red ellipse, this very ordinary, extraordinary thing. Then she fills a glass with water, and she swallows it down. And she goes back to the living room and picks up her knitting again, and the warmth begins its slow spread from the centre of her, and the hard edges of the day begin, gradually to soften. The needles click, the television murmurs, the lamplight holds the room in its amber warmth. Outside, the suburb is quiet. Every house holds its own version of this evening, every bedroom will hold its own version of this night. And in 100 kitchens, in 100 cabinets, the amber bottles wait. Let the image of those kitchens settle around you, the stillness of them, the particular quality of a room that has been in full use all day and has now gone quiet. The hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the clock, the lamplight from the hallway, falling in a narrow band across the linoleum floor. You are very comfortable here. Your body is heavy in the good way, the way of a body that has released its effort and is resting. Your breathing is slow and even. The story is moving gently, carrying you forward through its world, and there is nowhere you need to be but here, inside it. Let your eyes close a little more. Let the evening hold you. We're going to rest here for just a moment before we move on. Every era contains, somewhere within itself, the seeds of its own revision. The 1950s were no different. Beneath the smooth surface of the suburban ideal, beneath the photographable kitchens and the well-maintained lawns and the amber bottles in their cabinets, a different kind of consciousness was beginning to form, not yet articulated, not yet organised, but present, the way a crack is present in plaster before it becomes visible, as a structural fact waiting for conditions to make it legible. The women who would eventually give that consciousness its language were, in 1957, living inside the same decade as Margaret and Ruth and Eleanor. They were making the same beds and managing the same households and attending the same PTA meetings. But something in their experience was beginning to find its way toward expression, through letters to magazine editors, through conversations with physicians that went slightly differently than the usual conversation, through the particular restlessness of people who have been patient for a long time and are beginning to feel the limit of their patience. The magazines themselves were an unlikely early vehicle for this emerging consciousness. McCall's magazine had introduced in 1954 a concept it called togetherness, a vision of family life in which husband and wife participated jointly in the domestic world, sharing not just a household, but a unified vision of what that household was for. The concept was editorially intended as an affirmation of the family unit, a celebration of post-war stability and the domestic pleasures that stability had made possible. But something unexpected happened when women read about togetherness. They wrote letters, not all of them celebratory. Some of them were letters from women who read the word togetherness and experienced it as a description of something they did not have. Women who understood their domestic labour as labour rather than as shared participation, who recognised in the magazine's warm image a gap between the image and their own experience that the image had no language for. The editors of McCall's received these letters with some surprise. They had not intended to open a conversation. The conversation opened itself. Betty Friedan, who was working as a freelance journalist at the time, and who would in 6 years publish the book that gave the problem its name, was paying attention. She was gathering data, conducting interviews, reading research, consulting with psychologists and sociologists who were themselves beginning to notice patterns in the lives of educated middle-class women that the dominant cultural narrative could not accommodate. She was building the argument that would eventually become the feminine mystique, though she did not yet know the shape of what she was building. But we are not waiting for 1963, because the cracks in the surface were appearing before Friedan found her title. They were appearing in doctors' offices, where the volume and the character of women's complaints were beginning to accumulate into a pattern that some physicians were finding difficult to explain solely in terms of individual nervous constitution. They were appearing in the psychiatric literature, where case studies of barbiturate dependence among housewives were beginning to constitute a recognizable clinical category, rather than a collection of isolated incidents. And they were appearing in the lives of individual women, in the moment when a woman realized, with a clarity that surprised her, that the thing she had been managing was not going to be managed away. Eleanor is one of these women. She arrives at her realization on a Tuesday morning in October, in a way that is entirely undramatic and entirely private. She's standing at the kitchen counter, and she's trying to remember what she was about to do, and the trying takes slightly longer than it should. And the moment of blankness, the second and a half when the thought she was reaching for does not arrive, is not new. It has been happening with increasing frequency. Small blanks, brief interruptions in the otherwise continuous flow of the day's management, each one individually insignificant, together accumulated, beginning to feel like something worth noticing. She thinks, I am 51 years old. She thinks, my mother at 51 was sharp. She thinks, I do not feel sharp. And then, in the way that thoughts arrive when they have been approaching for a long time and finally reach the surface, she thinks about the bottle, about the 5 years of capsules, about the dose that is higher than it was, about the mornings that feel muffled until almost noon, about the dread she feels when the bottle is running low. She does not reach a complete understanding in this moment. That is not how understanding usually works, rarely arrives as a single, complete illumination. It arrives as a question, where before there had only been an assumption. The assumption had been, I do not sleep well, and the medication helps me. The question, forming now at the kitchen counter, is, what if the medication is part of why I do not sleep well? It is a small question. It fits in a single sentence. But it is a different kind of sentence than she has had available to her before, and the fact of its existence changes something. In the room, in the morning, in the way the light falls through the kitchen window onto the counter where she is standing. She does not call her doctor immediately. She thinks about it for several days, carrying the question with her through the ordinary operations of the household. She thinks about how to say it, how to frame it in a way that will be received as a genuine inquiry rather than as a failure to follow medical advice or a resistance to treatment. She's aware, with a particular social awareness of a woman who has spent decades navigating institutional spaces from a position of relative subordination, that her question could be received badly, that the doctor might hear it as a complaint or as hypochondria, or as the kind of female anxiety that the prescription was supposed to be addressing. She decides to say it carefully. She phrases it as a question about the long-term use of the medication, rather than as an accusation directed at the prescription itself. She calls the office, she makes an appointment. The appointment goes better than she feared. Her doctor, not the original physician who prescribed the Seconal, but the one who inherited the prescription when she moved, is younger than Dr. Hartley. He completed his residency in 1953, and the medical literature he read during those years includes papers on barbiturate dependence that his older colleagues may have encountered only as emerging clinical anomalies. He has been thinking about long-term barbiturate prescriptions with more caution than the decade's general practice consensus might suggest. He listens to Eleanor's question. He pauses before answering. He does not dismiss it. He says, "That is a good question, and I think it deserves a careful answer." This is, in the medical landscape of 1957, a somewhat unusual response. It is not the response that most women bringing this kind of question to their physicians would have received. But it is the response Eleanor receives, and it matters. The careful answer takes several appointments to develop. It involves a gradual reduction in the Seconal dose, not abrupt discontinuation, which the doctor understands would produce withdrawal symptoms that could be severe, but a slow tapering, a tenth of a capsule at a time, over the course of months. It involves conversations about sleep hygiene, a term the decade does not yet use, but the concept behind it is ancient and simple. The management of the conditions of sleep, the habits and environments that make rest possible without chemical assistance. It involves eventually a referral to a psychiatrist, a step that Eleanor takes with some reluctance, because in 1957 the word psychiatrist carries social weight, that makes it feel like a disclosure she's not entirely comfortable making, but which she makes anyway, because the alternative is the amber bottle and the muffled mornings and the question that will not stop forming itself in her mind. The tapering is not easy. There are nights that are genuinely difficult, nights when sleep does not come readily, when the body's readjusting chemistry produces a restlessness that makes the bed feel like the wrong place to be. There are mornings that feel like beginning again from a starting point that is further back than she would like. The process is not a clean or comfortable one, but it is a process. It has a direction, and the direction toward less medication, toward a closer contact with her own unmedicated experience of the world, is one she chose. That choice, that exercise of her own judgment against the inertia of a treatment she had been receiving passively for 5 years, is itself something. Not a dramatic act of rebellion, not a political gesture, simply a woman deciding to find out what is true about her own body and her own life, and being willing to accept the difficulty of the finding out. Not every woman in the suburb makes this choice. Not every woman has the particular circumstances, the younger doctor, the accumulated clarity, the particular Tuesday morning at the kitchen counter, that make the choice possible. Margaret is still filling her prescription. Ruth has recently had her dose adjusted upward and is sleeping better than she has in months. Dorothy, at 43 years of Seconal use, has a physical dependence that is deep enough that tapering will require a level of medical oversight that her physician has not yet offered. But Eleanor is tapering, and across the country, in dozens of individual doctor-patient conversations and psychiatric consultations and kitchen counter moments of private clarity, other women are beginning to ask the question that Eleanor asked. The cracks in the surface are widening slowly, the way cracks widen, not all at once, but with the steady, patient inevitability of structural truth working its way toward visibility. Something is changing. It is changing slowly. It has not yet changed. But the direction of the change is set, the way a season's direction is set even in the weeks when the weather does not yet show it. Outside Eleanor's window, the October trees are at their peak colour. The maples in a red so vivid it seems almost to generate its own light, the oaks holding their bronze, the elms beginning their long shedding. The sky above them is the particular blue of autumn, a blue with a clarity and a depth that summer's haze conceals, and that appears again each year at this time like a sky that has been washed and returned. Eleanor stands at her window and looks at it. She has been standing at windows looking out at yards for many years, but this morning, something in the looking is slightly different, more present. More here, in the body, in the eyes, in the actual yard with its actual trees and its actual October sky. The Seconal is at a lower dose now. The muffled quality of the mornings is beginning to lift. It is not entirely lifted. The tapering has weeks still to run, and the body's readjustment is gradual and non-linear, not a straight line from foggy to clear, but a series of better and worse days that trend, on average, toward the better. But this morning is a better morning, and the trees are very beautiful. Let that morning be here with us for a moment. The October light, the vivid maple, the particular blue of the washed sky. Let it be simple and present and sufficient. Breathe. The decade turned, not with the neat ceremonial quality that decade turning suggests in retrospect, but in the way that time always actually turns, continuously, without announcement, each day following the last with the same indifference to narrative structure that makes living inside history so different from reading about it afterward. The calendar changed from 1959 to 1960, and the suburbs looked the same, and the amber bottles were still in their cabinets, and the percolators were still on the burners, and the elm trees in the yards were still bare in January. But the cultural atmosphere was shifting in ways that would, within a few years, produce changes that the decade of the amber bottle could not have predicted from inside itself. The first of these changes was pharmaceutical. In 1960, a Swiss pharmaceutical company introduced a new compound, chlordiazepoxide, under the trade name Librium. It was followed in 1963 by diazepam, which was marketed as Valium. These drugs belonged to a new class, the benzodiazepines. They were prescribed for anxiety and tension, as sedatives and sleep aids, and they were offered to physicians and patients as an improvement on the barbiturates. Safer, the marketing said, less toxic in overdose. less likely to produce the respiratory depression that made barbiturate overdose so dangerous. The benzodiazepines would eventually prove to have their own complicated relationship with dependence and withdrawal, a reckoning that would come, for that class of drugs, in the decades following their introduction. But in 1963 they arrived as a kind of solution, a pharmacological upgrade, and Valium in particular achieved a cultural presence that made Seconal's mid-decade prominence look modest. By the early 1970s, Valium was the most prescribed medication in the United States. The Rolling Stones wrote their song about Mother's Little Helper in 1966, and while the lyric referred specifically to a small yellow pill that helped the housewife get through the day, the cultural reference was broad enough to encompass the entire category of pharmaceutical sedation that women in the domestic role had been offered as a management strategy for more than a decade. But we're moving slightly ahead of ourselves. Let us return to the early 1960s, to the moment when the language that had been missing finally began to arrive. The Feminine Mystique was published in February of 1963. Betty Friedan had spent years building it from interviews, research studies, and the testimony of women whose experience matched her own. Educated women who'd been educated toward a professional life, and then, by the cultural gravity of the post-war domestic ideal, redirected into the kitchen. The book was not a universal description of women's experience in the decade. Its primary subjects were white, educated, middle-class women, a specific demographic whose particular frustrations were shaped by the gap between their educational preparation and their domestic reality. Women of colour, working-class women, women for whom the suburban housewife ideal was not a constraint but an aspiration that their material circumstances placed out of reach. Their stories were not centred in Friedan's analysis, and this would become, in subsequent decades, a significant point of critique and expansion. But within its scope, the book was a detonation. The language it provided, the problem that has no name, the feminine mystique, the comfortable concentration camp of the domestic ideal, was language that women had not had access to before, and the access it provided was revelatory in the way that naming is always revelatory. The thing that was felt but could not be spoken suddenly becomes speakable, and the world rearranges itself around the new word. Women read the book and wrote letters to Friedan in enormous numbers. The letters were, many of them, variations on the same theme. I thought it was just me. The relief of discovering that the unnamed thing was not a personal deficiency, not a failure of one's own nervous system or character, but a structural condition produced by a world organised in a specific and identifiable way, that relief was, for many women, the most significant intellectual and emotional event of the decade. The book did not directly address the question of the barbiturates or the tranquilizers, but it addressed the conditions that had made them necessary, and in addressing those conditions it made possible a different kind of conversation about the pills. A conversation in which the pill was not the solution to a personal problem, but a symptom of a structural one. A conversation that could ask, finally, why do so many women need to be medicated to get through their days? This conversation did not happen all at once, or in all places simultaneously, or in a way that produced immediate and dramatic change. Social change rarely works that way. It works the way water works, finding the available channels, moving through them, widening them gradually, the force of the movement accumulating over time. In 1963, the conversation was beginning. By 1965, it was wider. By 1970, it had become part of the public discourse in a way that made it possible for women to speak about their experience of prescription sedatives in a framework that did not require them to accept the framing of personal inadequacy. In the medical community, a parallel shift was beginning to occur, slower, more technical, less culturally dramatic, but significant in its own way. The accumulating clinical evidence of barbiturate dependence was beginning to produce changes in prescribing practices. Case reports had accumulated into case series into retrospective analyses into the early forms of the prospective studies that would eventually establish clearer pictures of the patterns and risks of long-term barbiturate use. The regulatory environment was also changing. The thalidomide disaster of the early 1960s, which had produced severe birth defects in thousands of children in Europe and narrowly been avoided in the United States through the resistance of an FDA reviewer named Francis Kelsey, prompted the Kefauver-Harris Amendment of 1962, which significantly strengthened the requirements for demonstrating drug safety and efficacy before approval. The regulatory atmosphere became more cautious. Barbiturate prescribing for anxiety and insomnia began its slow decline. The transition to benzodiazepines, which occupied most of the 1960s and into the 1970s, was partly a response to genuine concern about barbiturate safety. The benzodiazepines were meaningfully safer in terms of acute toxicity, the overdose threshold much higher, and partly it was the ordinary operation of the pharmaceutical market. New compounds, new patents, new marketing, the industry's constant motion toward the next innovation. The amber bottle of Seconal gradually gave way to different bottles, different pills, different colours, the same underlying dynamic in a new pharmacological form. But for the women who had been taking Seconal through the 1950s and into the early 1960s, the transition to new medications or the gradual reduction in prescribing rates did not automatically resolve the situation their bodies were in. Dependence, once established, is a physical fact that does not respond to cultural shifts or regulatory changes. Eleanor's tapering was a process of months. For women with longer standing and higher dose dependence, the process was longer and more difficult, and the medical support for undertaking it was often inadequate, not because physicians were unwilling, but because the protocols for managing barbiturate withdrawal and tapering had not yet been developed into the systematic clinical guidance that would eventually be available. There is a woman named Grace who lives in a suburb of a different city, in a house with a green door and a garden that she tends herself, that she has tended herself for 15 years. That is the one space in her domestic life where she has the kind of absorbed, purposeful engagement that the kitchen and the laundry room and the scheduling of children's appointments do not provide. Her hands in the garden know what to do. The decisions required are real decisions. Where to place the bulbs, how much to cut back the roses, when to wait for the soil to dry before turning it, and making them correctly produces visible results. The kind of visible results that the management of a household rarely provides, where the successful completion of a task means that the task will need to be done again tomorrow. Grace has been taking Seconal for 7 years. She has read about the feminine mystique. Not yet read it, but read about it. In the book review section of the newspaper that arrives each morning and which she reads, cover to cover, in the hour before the children come home, because the reading is the other thing, alongside the garden, where she's fully herself, and not the managed self of the domestic performance. She has a feeling, reading the review, that the book contains something she needs, that the language it is offering is language she's been waiting for. She calls the library and puts her name on the waiting list. There are 14 names ahead of her, which tells its own story about the appetite for what the book contains. While she waits for the library copy, she does something she has not done before. She talks to her neighbour Carol, not in the casual way of the backyard fence conversation, but with more directness. Over coffee at Carol's kitchen table, with the children at school and the morning stretching ahead, empty enough to hold a real conversation in. She says, "I've been thinking about the pills." Carol looks at her. There is a moment of the particular stillness that precedes a real answer rather than a social one. Carol says, "I have been thinking about them too," and the conversation that follows is not dramatic or revolutionary. It is two women sitting at a kitchen table in 1963, drinking coffee and telling each other true things about their experience. It is the conversation that the decade before had not had the framework to make possible. It is small and private, and it changes nothing about the structural world the women live in. But it changes something in the room. It changes the quality of the air between them, and it changes, in a way that is difficult to measure precisely but real nonetheless, what each of them believes is possible, what range of choices the world contains, what questions it is permissible to ask. Margaret, hearing about the conversation second-hand through the social network of the neighbourhood, feels something she cannot quite name in response. Interest, maybe. Recognition. The particular alert attention of a person who hears something that connects with an interior experience they have not yet fully examined. She's not ready to have that conversation yet. She's still taking her capsules, 2 now, at 9:30 in the evening, and her nights are managed, and her days are navigated, and the surface is intact. But the question is forming, the way Eleanor's question formed at the kitchen counter, slowly, from the bottom up, from the accumulated experience of managed days and muffled mornings, and the persistent low awareness that the thing being managed has not gone away. It is forming. It has not yet arrived. But its approach is detectable. the way the approach of a season is detectable before the weather shows it, in the quality of the light, in the angle of the afternoon sun, in some atmospheric shift too subtle to name precisely, but too real to ignore. Let the forming questions settle in the quiet of this story. We're not going to rush it. We're going to let it be where it is, approaching, not yet arrived, in the space between the awareness and the word. Outside, the seasons are turning again. The garden behind Grace's house is putting up its first crocuses, the thin purple ones that come before anything else, that push through the still cold ground in February with a persistence that seems every year slightly miraculous. The elm trees are beginning to bud, the tight dark buds that will take another month to open into the gauzy green of early spring, but that are present now as evidence, as promise. The world is moving forward, as it always is, slowly, and then less slowly, with the particular pace of a living things finding their way through resistance toward the conditions that allow them to grow. Breathe the spring air in with me. Let it be cool and slightly damp the way early spring air is, the smell of thawed ground, of bark in the thin sunlight, of the particular freshness that winter's clean erasure makes possible. Let it fill the chest. Let it settle there. We're near the end of the story now, and the end is quiet, as endings should be. Every story that is told with care eventually arrives at the place where the telling must account for what the events left behind, not a resolution in the sense of a problem solved, because the problems we have been tracing through these quiet suburban kitchens and these careful lives were not solved, not cleanly, not all at once, but a reckoning, a moment of seeing clearly what happened and what it means and what it cost, held in the particular light that time allows, from a distance that makes the shape of things visible in ways that proximity conceals. What happened in the 1950s and early 1960s with barbiturate prescribing for women was not a conspiracy. It was not a deliberate act of harm directed at a specific population by identifiable villains. It was something simultaneously less dramatic and more instructive, a systemic failure, distributed across an entire culture, in which medicine and industry and social expectation and individual good intentions combined to produce an outcome that none of its individual components intended, and that the system as a whole could not see while it was inside it. The physicians who prescribed Seconal to their female patients were, with very few exceptions, doing what they believed was right for those patients. The pharmaceutical companies that marketed barbiturates were operating within the standards and regulations of their time. The women who accepted the prescriptions were doing what their culture had prepared them to do, placing their trust in medical authority, seeking relief for genuine suffering through the channels available to them. The husbands who noticed that their wives seemed calmer and slept better, and said nothing about the amber bottle in the cabinet were not cruel. They were simply inhabiting the same framework as everyone else, a framework that categorized their wives' difficulty as medical rather than structural, and therefore as properly managed by medicine. The failure was in the framework itself, in the assumption that the distress of the women in the suburban kitchens was a feature of their individual psychologies, rather than a reasonable response to an unreasonable arrangement. In the prescription pad as the primary response to a problem that the prescription pad could manage but not address. In the absence of the question, what would need to change in this woman's world for her not to need this medication? That question, when it finally began to be asked, in doctors' offices, in the pages of books and magazines, in the conversations between women sitting at kitchen tables, revealed the depth of the structural answer required. Not a different pill, not a better pill, a different world. A world in which the labour of domestic life was distributed more equitably, in which women's participation in the paid economy was not systematically discouraged, in which the emotional labour of maintaining a household was recognised as labour rather than as natural female vocation, in which a woman who could not name what was troubling her was asked what her world was like rather than given a prescription to help her manage within it. That world was not delivered quickly or cleanly. The decades that followed the 1950s were complicated. The women's movement of the 1960s and 1970s produced enormous and real changes in the legal and cultural landscape. But those changes were contested and incomplete, and their benefits distributed unevenly across different populations of women. The prescription of benzodiazepines to women, Valium, Librium, and their descendants, continued through the 1970s and into the 1980s and produced its own reckoning. The pattern did not end when the decade ended, or when the barbiturates were replaced. It evolved, the underlying dynamic finding new pharmacological expression, the structural question still largely unasked in the clinical conversation. What did change, gradually, and with the force of things that have been true for a long time finding finally their acknowledgement, was the conversation. The language that Frieden's book helped provide, and that subsequent decades of feminist scholarship and activism elaborated and complicated and deepened, made it possible to name the thing that had been generating the insomnia and the fatigue and the low afternoon hum of unnamed distress. And naming it was not the solution. Naming is never, by itself, the solution. But it was the necessary precondition for solution. You cannot address what you cannot name. You cannot change what you cannot see. The women who lived through the decade of the amber bottle were not primarily victims, though they were harmed. They were people doing their best inside a system they had not designed and could not fully see, a description that applies with varying specifics to nearly every human being navigating every era. Their lives were real and full and contained, alongside the difficulty. Genuine love and purpose and pleasure and the particular satisfactions of domesticity that are real regardless of the political analysis of the structures that organise them. The garden that Grace tended, the children that Margaret raised, the bridge club that Eleanor attended on Thursday afternoons, where the conversation ranged from neighbourhood news to the particular kind of sharp, funny commentary on the world that emerges among women who have been managing their public expressions for so long that the unguarded private conversation becomes its own distinct register of intelligence and wit. These lives were not wasted, they were lived. The difficulty they contained was real, and it cost something real, and the cost should be acknowledged honestly. But the living was also real, in all its complexity and texture and human fullness, and the acknowledgement of one does not require the erasure of the other. What was left behind? When the decade ended and the next decade and the next brought their own complications and changes, was a lesson that medicine has had to learn and relearn in various forms across its history. The pill that manages symptoms is not the same thing as the treatment that addresses causes, and the willingness to manage symptoms in preference to addressing causes is not a morally neutral clinical choice. It reflects a set of assumptions about whose difficulty is worth addressing at the structural level and whose can be pharmacologically contained. The women in the suburban kitchens of the 1950s were offered containment when they deserved engagement. They were offered sleep when they deserved the conditions in which sleep comes naturally, without chemical assistance, because the day has been rich enough and free enough and sufficiently their own that the night can receive them with grace. They did not always get those conditions, but some of them, like Eleanor at her kitchen counter, and Grace talking to Carol over coffee, and the thousands of women who read Frieden's book and wrote letters saying I thought it was just me, began to understand that those conditions were what they were owed, that the deficit was not in themselves. That understanding, fragile and partial and unevenly distributed as it was, is what the decade bequeathed to the ones that followed. Not the amber bottle, not the smooth, reliable descent of the barbiturate into the prescribed dark. But the question, the small, large question that Eleanor asked at her kitchen counter on an October morning, looking at a yard where the trees were at their peak colour and the sky was washed and clear and very blue. What if I didn't need this? What would need to change for that to be true? The question is still being asked. The answers are still being worked toward. This is how it always is, with the deep things. The progress is real but incomplete, the understanding partial but growing, the world different from what it was but not yet what it could be. Let the question rest here, in the quiet of the story's closing pages. Let it be held gently, without urgency. We do not need to answer it tonight. We only need to recognize it, to see it clearly in the lamplight for what it is, a beginning, a crack in the surface through which something true is coming. A Tuesday morning in October, and the maple in the yard, and the sky above it, washed and blue and going on. Let your eyes close fully now. The story has told itself. The decade has moved through its seasons and arrived at the edge of the next one. The women we have followed are resting now, in the particular rest of people who have been seen. Not solved, not rescued, but genuinely seen. their lives held in the attention they deserved. The house is quiet, the kitchen is dark, the cabinet above the stove is closed. Outside, whatever season it is always some season, the world always in the middle of some turning. The sky's doing what it does, moving, holding its stars or its clouds or its particular quality of light in the hour before dawn, when the darkness has not yet lifted but has begun very slightly to consider it. We are in that hour now. The story is settling into its last pages. Breathe with me slowly, all the way in, all the way out. Good. The kitchen is still. The percolator is cold on the burner. The breakfast things are laid for morning, the cups turned right side up on their saucers, the plates stacked neatly in the cupboard, the table wiped clean of the day's accumulated crumbs and evidence. Outside, the neighbourhood is in its deepest quiet. It is the hour when even the houses seem to breathe more slowly, the furnace cycling down, the water heater ticking gently as the temperature drops, the particular stillness of 3 a.m. settling into the spaces between the walls. Somewhere in the suburb a woman is sleeping. She's sleeping deeply and without dreams, in the good way, the way of a body that has been permitted, finally, to rest all the way down to the bottom of itself. In the garden the first crocuses have pushed up through the cold ground, their thin stems holding against the night. The stars are out. The elm tree holds its bare branches against them, still and patient. The world continues, quietly and with great persistence. The world continues. You are somewhere safe. The story is finished. There is nothing required of you now but this. The slow breath, the heavy warmth of the body at rest, the gentle loosening of the day's last held things. Let them go. Let it all go. The kitchen is still. The house is quiet. Sleep now. Sleep. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us continue making more content. Anyways, see you in the next one.